Thank you. Thank you to Father Antonio for inviting me to this. I realized I have in my folder here the talk I prepared for this, but I also have a lecture on the intellectual culture of the 12th and 13th century that I gave to freshmen on Friday, if you would rather hear that. Or shall we go with liberal society and pluralism? Unlike Professor Carrazzo, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm married to a lawyer. And I'm married to a lawyer who does immigration law and does a lot of political asylum cases. That's sort of her specialty. She has actually a subspecialty in people who have criminal convictions. So I address these questions with her sort of, in a sense, in my own mind at least, if not in physical reality, looking over my shoulder. And so she is someone who works within the institutions of a liberal society and tries to do what she can within them, and so I always bear that in mind. Now, Dignitatis humanae, the Declaration on Religious Freedom, as far as I can tell, says nothing directly about the pluralistic nature of modern liberal societies. There's no analysis of pluralism in there. The fact of religious pluralism is reflected in the references to religious communities in the plural. I assume they don't mean different religious orders in the Catholic Church, and the acknowledgement of their freedom to govern themselves according to their own norms. So we can perhaps find even something like an endorsement, or maybe a limited endorsement of pluralism in the Declaration's injunction that, quote, the usages of society are to be the usages of freedom in their full range. That is, the freedom of man is to be respected as far as possible and is not to be curtailed except when and insofar as necessary. But the question of pluralism and religious liberty in liberal society are really questions that have come to the fore only more recently. And when one is confronted with a session title such as "Can a Liberal Society be Pluralistic?" it's tempting to presume that the answer to the question is supposed to be no, and the only role that I have is to explain why this is the case. I'll go ahead and say it, Rodney. As a colleague of mine said, the topic of the session is a little bit like, has liberal society stopped beating its wife? I hesitated because spousal abuse, of course, is not funny, but the remark was funny. Now, I'm going to succumb in the first part of this paper to that temptation to answer no, though in the end I'm going to raise some qualifications to that answer. So, according to one influential account, that of Alistair MacIntyre, the problem of liberalism and pluralism goes something like this. Liberalism is, quote, the project of founding a form of social order in which individuals could emancipate themselves from the contingency and particularity of tradition by appealing to genuinely universal, tradition-independent norms which would enable those who espouse widely different and incompatible conceptions of the good for human life, good for human beings, to live together peaceably within the same society, enjoying the same political status and engaging in the same economic relations. A classic MacIntyre sentence. In other words, liberalism brackets the question of the highest good on a societal level in order to create a society in which those with competing accounts of the good life can coexist by agreeing on the less than ultimate good of getting along together in an atmosphere of, at best, mutual respect or at least mutual toleration. In yet other words, liberalism posits a society that can function effectively despite the presence within it of a pluralism of accounts of the good. The problem arises, however, when these accounts of the good try to move from the realm of private or semi-private opinion to the realm of public policy. So MacIntyre continues, quote, every individual is to be equally free to propose and to live by whatever conception of the good he or she pleases, derived from whatever theory or tradition he or she may adhere to, unless that conception of the good involves reshaping the life of the rest of the community in accordance with it. In other words, liberal society can be pluralistic in terms of privately held conceptions of the highest good, except for those conceptions of the highest good that include, as an intrinsic part, the reshaping of society so as to conform to that highest good. Or, finding an unlikely ally, as Auguste Comte put it, systematic toleration cannot exist and really never has existed except with regard to opinions regarded as unimportant or doubtful. The only society-shaping conceptions of the highest good that can be admitted to discussion are those that are based not on particular traditions of rationality, but on abstract, universal reason. The problem from MacIntyre's perspective, as I'm sure most of you know, is that he thinks no such abstract, universal reason exists. All rationality is tradition constituted. The shared rationality that is the basis of liberal democracy is not tradition neutral, but is itself a tradition with its own conception of the good that is in competition with the conceptions of the good found in other traditions. Thus, MacIntyre's criticism. Now, we've already heard a good bit about John Rawls, and I thought about editing this section down, but I think I decided to leave it in because, it bears repeating, because the philosophy of John Rawls might serve as Exhibit A in MacIntyre's case against liberalism. Now, what MacIntyre calls tradition is what Rawls calls a comprehensive doctrine. And what MacIntyre calls universal tradition-independent norms is what Rawls calls the political conception. So bearing those transpositions in mind, we can find Rawls writing about the relationship of these two. Quote, "I assume all citizens affirm a comprehensive doctrine to which the political conception they accept is in some way related." Except maybe for John Rawls himself. In other words, nobody lives entirely on the basis of their political conception. Right? They have a larger set of beliefs. But a distinguishing feature of a political conception is that it is presented as freestanding and expounded without reference to any such wider background. To use a current phrase, the political conception is a module, an essential constituent part that fits into and can be supported by various reasonable comprehensive doctrines that endure in the society regulated by it. It's like a little Lego block, and you can use it to make a house, or you can use it to make a car, or you can use it to make a spaceship. So for Rawls, these comprehensive doctrines, which he typically classifies as religious, philosophical, and moral, belong to what he calls the background culture of civil society, and therefore, quote, to the social, not the political. They are, within a democratic society, irreducibly plural. And this is because there is, for Rawls, no public way of adjudicating their differences. This is on account of what he calls the burdens of judgment, which include such things as the complexity of conflicting evidence, the difficulty of determining the weight and relevance of that evidence, the inherent vagueness of many of our concepts, the uniqueness of individual experience, and therefore the irreducible diversity of such experiences. These burdens of judgment, or we might say epistemological limitations, make it for Rawls impossible to say that one's comprehensive doctrine is the only reasonable one. Yet, at the same time, it is for Rawls possible to distinguish between that set of comprehensive doctrines that are reasonable and the set of those that are not. And he distinguishes these two sets of comprehensive doctrines in this way. Reasonable persons see that the burden of judgment set limits on what can be reasonably justified to others, and so they endorse some form of liberty of conscience and freedom of thought. In other words, one's comprehensive doctrine is reasonable to the degree that it allows for the existence of other reasonable comprehensive doctrines, even if one does not judge those other doctrines to be rationally justified. So there's a difference between a comprehensive doctrine being reasonable and a comprehensive doctrine being rationally justified. You do not have to have a rationally justified doctrine for it to be reasonable. All you have to do is agree to tolerate other doctrines that are similarly reasonable. What matters politically speaking is that the holders of these different comprehensive doctrines share a commitment to tolerance, fairness, and equality, the political conception of liberalism, not the background beliefs that undergird that commitment. This commitment is, as Rawls terms it, a module that can be fitted into a variety of different comprehensive doctrines from which it can draw its power. Right? So even though it's separable, there's some ambiguity in Rawls, particularly the later Rawls, as to whether this module is actually self-sustaining. I think he says conflicting things. A second relevant aspect of Rawls' thought, and perhaps more famous than his later thinking about comprehensive doctrines, is his understanding of what he calls the original position. And again, many of you are probably already familiar with this. He describes this notion of the original position as a purely hypothetical situation in which, quote, no one knows his place in a society, his class position or social status, nor does anyone know his fortune in the distribution of natural assets and abilities, his intelligence, strength, and the like. Moreover, and more interestingly even, those in the original position, quote, do not know their conceptions of the good or their special psychological propensities. And it's behind what he calls this veil of ignorance that the principles of justice must be chosen, the social contract formed. Because it is only in this original position in which you don't know how you will benefit from the social contract that one can fairly choose the social arrangements that are characterized by fairness. Here we would seem to have a self, albeit, Rawls says, a hypothetical one, that is, in MacIntyre's terms, emancipated from the contingency of and particularity of tradition. From the perspective of someone like MacIntyre, the sleight of hand in which Rawls is engaged is to present what he calls the political conception of liberalism as something that is not embedded in its own distinct comprehensive doctrine. The module of political liberalism, MacIntyre would maintain, is in fact a custom-built part that really only works when fitted into a comprehensive doctrine that is amenable to its secular, atomistic, and voluntaristic presuppositions, which we see embodied in the notion of the person who stands in the original position. I think one of the places you can really see this is that Rawls, to the end, thinks of us as choosing our comprehensive doctrines, which is really something rather radically different from MacIntyre's understanding of how we occupy a tradition. Now, this is the kind of charge of which Rawls is aware, and he is resolute in rejecting the claim that his account of political liberalism presumes any particular comprehensive doctrine or metaphysical picture of the person. So, for example, as I've said, his original position of the human person behind the veil of ignorance is not a metaphysics, but what he calls a representation. One might say a thought experiment for the specific purpose of forming a political conception of justice. Still, one might wonder how free of metaphysics Rawls' political conception in fact is, particularly when he says such things as, quote, values of the political are very great values and hence not easily overridden. These values govern the basic framework of social life, the very groundwork of our existence, and specify the fundamental terms of political and social cooperation. The phrase, the very groundwork of our existence, he takes from Mill. It is difficult to hear a phrase like the very groundwork of our existence as being entirely free of metaphysical entanglements. Now, perhaps unfairly, right? Perhaps unfairly to Rawls, I would like to exploit the opening that this phrase makes to raise the metaphysical stakes in the critique. This is, after all, a communio conference, so we have to really get to the red meat of metaphysics, right? And I'd like to do this by describing two different metaphysical accounts, both from the Middle Ages, of how we might think about the plurality of the world. First, the account found in medieval Christian theology as exemplified, but not exclusively found in, Thomas Aquinas. And second, the account found in the Orthodox Asharite theology of Islam as exemplified by Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. These accounts are rooted in the soil of philosophical reflection stretching back to antiquity on the question of the one and the many. From as far back as human beings have engaged in philosophical reflection, they have been aware that we find ourselves living in a world with all sorts of different kinds of beings. Inanimate and animate, animal and vegetable, irrational and rational, female and male, butchers and bakers and candlestick makers. What accounts for this plurality of kinds of beings? Moreover, within these diverse kinds, we find an even more radical plurality. This rock is not that rock. This woman has red hair and that woman has blonde. This butcher is highly skilled and that one is missing several fingers. Yet, at the same time, this world of diversity, in some sense, constitutes a single thing, a universe or a cosmos. Now, monotheistic theological visions raise the stakes even further by adding to the ancient question of the one and the many the further question of how the Creator God relates to the unity and plurality of the cosmos and how that cosmos glorifies its creator. Thomas Aquinas' account of created plurality approaches the issue from the question of why it is that a cosmos marked by plurality better reflects the glory of God than one marked by uniformity. Could not God's glory be reflected in a creation containing just one kind of thing, say hydrogen? Or indeed containing a single individual, say one most excellent hydrogen atom? For Thomas, the reason for the plurality of creatures and of kinds is because the perfection of the infinite creator is best imaged in a finite creation by a diversity of creatures. Since, as Thomas writes in the Compendium Theologiae, it was impossible that one thing perfectly represent the divine goodness because of the remoteness of each creature from God, therefore it was necessary that many things represent him, so that one supplied what the other lacks. Thomas's account of the diversity of creation, however, does not simply affirm a plurality of creatures and kinds, but requires as well that this plurality be an ordered one. That is to say, these many creatures must be differentiated across a hierarchically ordered series in which those beings that are more fully actual have a causal role in relation to those beings that are less actual, acting as secondary but genuine causes. For Thomas, to deny the ordered relationship of cause and effect pertaining between created beings is, quote, to deprive them of their best possession. For individual things are good in themselves, but all things together are best because of the order of the whole. This order of the whole can only be a result of relationships of cause and effect, quote, for in regard to things that are different in their natures, there can be no gathering together into a unity of order unless by the fact that some of them act and others undergo action. Thus, for Thomas, the reconciliation of the one and the many, how it is that the world God makes can be a unity and diversity, is dependent upon creatures being hierarchically differentiated by the relationships of cause and effect among themselves. And this part's important, relations that grow from properties intrinsic to the nature of the creature entering into that relationship. Now, Thomas's understanding of the unity and plurality of the universe can be contrasted with what he at least took to be the view held by Orthodox Muslim thinkers. From Moses Maimonides, he's aware of the Islamic Kalam theologians of the Asharite school who deny the genuine causal efficacy of creatures. Al-Ghazali, in his The Incoherence of the Philosophers, offers the famous example of fire burning cotton. Quote, "What proof is there that the fire is the agent? They have no proof other than observing the occurrence of the burning at the juncture of contact with the fire. Something's existence with a thing does not prove that it exists by that thing." In contrast to Thomas's view, it seems that there is no causal relationship between fire and the cotton that burns. The specific concern among these Muslim theologians was to ensure that all agency not be reduced to necessary causality, which would, in their view, entail a denial of the possibility of miracles. A broader concern was to underscore the contingency of all occurrences and their radical dependence on God's will. Fire burns cotton in each and every instance only because God wills that the cotton burn. This long-established orthodoxy among Muslim thinkers was undergirded by a metaphysics in which all creation consisted solely of indistinguishable atoms and their accidental configurations, the former having no properties apart from the latter, which are perpetually perishing, to be renewed in existence solely by God. This atomism denies that creatures have stable natures by which they act. Rather, they are contingent arrangements of atoms that are destroyed in the instant after they come into existence, only to be replaced by new arrangements that might or might not be the same as arrangements of the prior instant. Cotton burns not because of fire, but because God rearranges the atoms in the cotton. Now, Al-Ghazali recounts in The Incoherence of the Philosophers that critics of this view like to point out that on this account, someone who leaves a book in his house might return to find that it is turned into, quote, a beardless slave boy, intelligent, busy with his tasks, or into an animal that has defiled the library with its urine and dung. Given the polymorphous perversity of modernity, this is not too unlikely a possibility. Now, Al-Ghazali's response to this criticism is to say that, quote, God created us for the knowledge that he did not enact these possibilities. In other words, God has arranged the atoms in our brains so that we don't really consider this possibility happening. But they still remain genuine possibilities. In a way that seems to anticipate David Hume's later arguments, he says that what appear to us to be stable natures and causal efficacies are in fact simply the effect of, quote, the continuous habit of their occurrence repeatedly one time after another. Now, Thomas has his own criticisms of this Asharite theology. Its basic criticism is that it ends up undermining exactly what it wants to protect, which is the power of God. So, famously says, the perfection of the effect demonstrates the perfection of the cause. To detract from the perfection of creatures is to detract from the perfection of the divine power. So to deny causal efficacy to creatures is in fact to to insult the efficacy of God's power. So what do these debates among medieval thinkers have to do with liberalism and the question of pluralism? I suggest that Thomas's account of the nature of created diversity offers us a theological account of pluralism that is not simply a metaphysical postulate, but was actually embodied in the structure of society. I think this can be seen in the description by the late Émile Perrault-Saucine of the social structure of pre-revolutionary France. He writes, the society of the Ancien Régime was a complex web of privileges and corporations. Aristocratic by nature, it was a theory organized around a vertical chain of command that ran from top to bottom on the social scale with manifold ramifications. While we tend to think of aristocratic societies as being characterized primarily by the fixity of social status, what Perrault-Saucine draws our attention to is the plurality of the distribution of power in such societies. This we might call aristocratic pluralism was based on the ideal of every member of society having a distinctive set of rights and obligations, we might say effects and causes, that bound them together with others within a hierarchically structured social system, a kind of political cosmos. In the first half of the 19th century, Alexis de Tocqueville had written, "As in aristocratic communities, all the citizens occupy fixed positions, one above the other. The result is that each of them always sees a man above himself whose cooperation he may claim. Aristocracy had made a chain of all the members of the community, from the peasant to the king. Democracy breaks the chain and severs every link of it." Perrault-Saucine draws out this contrast between traditional aristocratic societies and liberal democracies. Quote, "Aristocratic regimes are intrinsically hierarchical. They are pluralist in that they recognize different levels of authority and power. Democratic systems, in contrast, repudiate the heterogeneous nature of the hierarchical worldview. They do not divide society up into orders. This egalitarian denial of all hierarchy has a powerful leveling effect, setting all ways of life on one and the same plane," end quote. Thus, in contrast to an aristocratic political cosmos, the democratic political cosmos, at least in its ideal form, presumes not the plurality of social roles based on status and tradition, but the interchangeable identities of its citizens. A principle as fundamental as one person, one vote, which seems entirely intuitive to us as citizens of a liberal democracy, enshrines a view of society quite different from the aristocratic pluralism of the pre-modern world. For the purpose of the most significant act of the citizen of a liberal democracy as citizen, that is the act of voting, the citizens are fundamentally identical. I don't know if anybody, some of the older folks here might remember the big ruckus over Bill Clinton's nomination of Lani Guinier for Attorney General, and she questioned the one person, one vote principle in some academic articles, and it was a storm. If Rawls is correct, the fundamental element from which the political cosmos is created via social contract are the indistinguishable individuals in the original position, behind the veil of ignorance. On this description of things, it is not difficult to hear in this echoes of the atoms that are configured by the divine will in occasionalist metaphysics, such as we find among the Asherites. Of course, the difference is that the atomized citizenry in a democratic political cosmos are not configured by the divine will, but freely configured themselves into a body politic, and this is a significant difference. Tocqueville, however, raised a troubling possibility. He said that in conflicts between democratic values of freedom and equality, it seems that equality tends to win out. That is, the people of democratic nations have, quote, "a natural taste for freedom, but for equality, their passion is ardent, insatiable, incessant, invincible. They call for equality and freedom, and if they cannot obtain that, they still call for equality in slavery." In other words, the democratic insistence on equality is open to totalitarian exploitation in a way that aristocratic societies, with their plurality of grades of citizens within their corresponding plurality of rights and obligations, are not. As Tocqueville notes, quote, "A man may be the equal of all his countrymen save one, who is the master of all without distinction and who selects equally from among them all the agents of his power." End quote. The commanding God of the occasionalist cosmos is the divine correlate of the commanding despot of totalitarian egalitarianism. So here is the charge. An aristocratic vision of the world and society in which people by nature fall into a hierarchical order is one that is inherently pluralistic. and resistant to totalitarian absolutism, while a liberal vision of the world and society in which all of the members of a society are, as citizens, fundamentally equal units, is one that is constantly in danger of succumbing to a totalitarianism that obliterates all true plurality. Even short of out-and-out totalitarianism, liberalism still militates against true difference inasmuch as it requires citizens to leave behind the particularities of their identities when they enter into the public square. How convincing is this charge against liberal society? Well, certainly an account like Rawls would seem to militate against true pluralism. Rawls claims that not only must one enter the sphere of politics, properly speaking, stripped of the particularities of one's religious or moral tradition, but also that this denuded self is in some sense ontologically prior to the self that is traditioned. He writes in A Theory of Justice, it is from the position of equal citizenship that persons join the various religious associations, and it is from this position that they should conduct their discussions with one another. The self that contracts the basic framework of social life, that is the very groundwork of our existence, is a self that has no comprehensive doctrine, a self that stands within no tradition, a self that stands rather in the original position behind the veil of ignorance, a self that is by design identical to every other self so situated. And as I have said, such a self bears a disturbing resemblance to the atoms that make up the occasionalist cosmos, subject to the despotic power of the divine ruler. Now, Rawls at least wants to claim that the self is more a thought experiment than a reality. And Jeffrey Stout has noted that given the actual social position of most of the students who would read Rawls, quote, it is good for them and good for the rest of us that they have at least once had to ask themselves what sort of social ground rules they would select if they did not know they were about to occupy positions of power and wealth. And I agree with Stout on that. I think that's right. But even if we take the self in the original position as simply a representation and not a reality, we must still reckon with the fact that it sets the terms of political engagement. It is what determines the norm of tolerance, and it is tolerance that qualifies a comprehensive doctrine as reasonable, and therefore itself a candidate for toleration. In other words, in order to be tolerated, a comprehensive doctrine must be willing and able to accept into itself the module of political liberalism. So all of this is very troubling. Yet I'm not quite ready to give up on aspects of liberal society for both positive and negative reasons. Positively, it seems clear to me that having tradition-grounded reasons for holding a particular view does not prevent one from giving reasons that might be acceptable to those who do not share one's tradition. In other words, I reject McIntyre's incommensurability thesis. I think it's philosophically flawed. We can see this in Dignitatis Humanae itself, which affirms that the dignity of human beings, quote, is known through the revealed word of God and by reason itself. While convictions held on the basis of a comprehensive doctrine might not be translatable without loss into another discourse, rough and ready communication is still possible, though not, of course, guaranteed. The demand, you don't know if liberal society is going to buy your argument until you make it. The demand of liberal society that we seek to make arguments that will be at least potentially convincing to the citizens holding other comprehensive doctrines is not only in itself not an unreasonable request, but it is also a request that accords well with the Catholic understanding of faith and reason. So that's the positive reason. Negatively, I'm not sure that I or any of you are really anxious to live in a society structured according to the aristocratic metaphysics that we find in Aquinas. Even if one thinks, as I do, that we can think of the universe as an ordered whole of agents and patients that by its differentiated order gives glory to God, I'm less than enthusiastic about aristocracy as the social correlate of that metaphysical vision. In aristocratic society, I would still be some combination of farmer and blacksmith. Even acknowledging the totalitarian uses to which it can be put, the idea of a sphere of public life in which people can meet as equal citizens seems, on the whole, less subject to abuse than aristocracy. As Jeffrey Stout notes, thought experiments like the original position and the sympathy and tolerance for the comprehensive doctrines of others that they engender can serve a valuable purpose, though they do not serve all human purposes, and I think this is the important point. And in particular, they do not serve the most important human purposes. A friend of mine once described voting, and I should note this is not a Catholic friend, but a friend of mine once described voting as being like a sacrament. This is clearly false. But just because it's not a sacrament doesn't mean that it is nothing. Given the bloody handprints that often adorn the doors of power, things like an absence of state-sponsored religious violence or the peaceful transfer of governmental control are not to be regarded too lightly. Just talk to people in nations where they don't have these things. The practices of liberal society, such as voting or, my favorite, the principle of habeas corpus, are not everything, but they are also not nothing. In the end, however, they're not enough. I suspect that something like Thomas's account of the role of a hierarchically structured pluralistic cosmos in giving glory to its creator might be necessary, not as a blueprint for society, but as the foundation of a deep appreciation of the intrinsic diversity of the world that not only gives us a true account of how things are, but can serve as a hedge against the totalitarian potential of egalitarian liberalism. Ironically, this aristocratic metaphysics might be exactly what is needed for a liberal society to be truly pluralistic. For it can produce citizens who can see divine glory reflected in, to use Jared Manley Hopkins' phrase, all things counter, original, spare, and strange. I'll note that he was a Scotist. Preserving and promoting this view is perhaps the distinctive political vocation of Christians who happen to find themselves living in liberal societies. I'll end with a quotation from Emile Perrault-Saucine. I'll give him the last word, who ends his book Catholicism and Democracy with the following suggestion. In a democratic world that works ceaselessly to eliminate otherness, even, perhaps especially, when it proclaims its commitment to pluralism, believers have an eye to something beyond the society of the here and now, and thus have an escape route from conformism. They form a breakwater against the tide of conformity. They are, par excellence, a sign of contradiction. Thank you.